Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. Is business a sport? Is sport a business? I'm Lou Pagnutti, and I'm a global managing partner responsible for finance, legal, risk, technology, and shared services. Today, and we had a perfect setup for those of you that were in the room before in the discussion in rugby and business. Today we're going to look at the parallels between sports and business. We're going to explore some themes: adaptation, we're going to look at sponsorship and brand value, and we're going to talk about what it means for communities and nations. I've got a very knowledgeable panel with me here today. I have Graham Bartlett, CEO of Velon, Beth Brooke-Marciniak, who is our EY Global Vice Chair of Public Policy, and I also have as well from Jaguar Land Rover Mark Cameron, who's a global leader of experiential marketing. And I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves so that you understand exactly why they're here today. So Graham, over to you.
Thank you, Lou. I'm the CEO of Velon. Velon is a relatively new company. It was formed by 11 of the elite cycling teams. The purpose of the company is to aggregate those teams' rights, put them all together, and develop the sport, mainly in the areas of technology and increased performance.
I'm Beth Brooke-Marciniak. As Lou said, I'm our Global Vice Chair at EY of Public Policy, but probably more importantly for this panel, I was an athlete, played basketball, multi-sport, but then basketball, and also was very active in our EY's activation of our sponsorship around the Rio Olympics, and in particular, aligning ourselves with the IOC's values of diversity and inclusion and our commitment to women as an emerging market, and really activating in a way where we tapped into the potential of women.
And Mark?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I head up Jaguar Land Rover in the global marketing team, responsibility for all of our acquisition of sports rights and the assets we have on the Jaguar brand and the Land Rover brand, which includes rugby, tennis, equestrian sports, sailing, tennis, motorsport. So, and I've been in the car business for about 23 years now.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, to use a metaphor, sports metaphor, let's dive right in. And Graham, I'd like to start with you. Adaptation certainly applies in both the business world, the sports world. What can sports learn from business? What can business learn from sports?
It's a big question to start with. There's a huge area there, clearly, that we could look at. In my particular business, I think there's two things that I would say at the moment that sport needs to learn from business. The first one is how to apply proper business models to what they're trying to achieve. In sport today, if you want to improve the quality of your product, and I was fascinated to hear what the previous speaker said about that with his rugby team, and how Mr. Altrud had talked about it as a product. Sport is a product. It's something that often within sport, they treat it as a bit of a dirty word. It's not product, it's sport. That's a mistake. Unless you have a really strong and solid business plan behind whatever you're trying to achieve in sport, you won't draw the investment, you won't improve the product, and you won't increase whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's fan base, engagement, or anything else. So one of the big things that sport has to learn more of from business is how to put together that really strong business plan to attract that investment. That's the first thing. I think on the reverse, what business can learn from sport is the application of performance metrics. I think in business sometimes we look at people's intelligence and we look at how they can perform in a very narrow sphere. In sport, to be successful, you have to be able to work as a team, you have to have discipline, you have to have performance criteria and metrics. And those things can transfer much better into business. Too many big companies are hiring people on how smart they are, not on how they can actually win business and develop business and lead business. And that's the area that I think that business can learn most from sport.
Great. And Beth, get your perspective. I know some of the work you've been doing, you've been looking at people in the business community and comparing them to whether or not they have a sports background. Maybe you want to comment on that.
Well, it really goes to, Graham, the point you just made, which is what I think business can learn from sport is sports creates leaders. And they know how to do it better than anyone, and business undervalues that to some extent. And so we have been looking at that. Interestingly, if we can just focus on the women's dimension of that, we've done some research that we just surveyed C-suite women, so arguably the most senior women in business, and what we found is that 94% of them played sport, and over half at a university level. So it doesn't say, you know, have your daughters go out and play sports and they're going to make it to the C-suite. That's not suggesting some correlation, but what it suggests is the leadership skills that get baked into a young woman athlete gives them all the skills that help them get ultimately to the C-suite. So it's a huge learning, and as Graham said, I think business today is not really valuing those leadership skills that an athlete brings into the workplace. When we talk to a lot of female employees, we discover that they were athletes, but they kind of put that away when they come into the workplace because business hasn't valued it, and so they stop valuing it themselves.
And Mark, we'll come to sponsorships in a minute, but anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think to your first question, at the end of the day, particularly professional sport, it has a product. So, you know, the synergies between a business that's creating a product or a service for a customer, sport does the same. And I think it has to continually understand the changing requirements, interests, and passion of their customers, the spectators or the viewers, and to continually evolve the product in order to make it still valuable and to still grow the business of sport. So absolutely understanding the customer, evolving, continue looking at what the customer wants, and how the sport is presented, I think, is a great parallel with business as well.
Right. One of the themes I want to raise now, gender, the whole gender matter. And if you look at what's happening in the world today, Danica Patrick and NASCAR, interesting, the 2012 Olympics, the first time women competed in each and every sport that men actually competed in. So how are women disrupting the status quo, whether you look at the management ranks or on the playing field? Beth, let's start with you.
Well, if you take the most recent example on the playing field, if you look at the U.S. women's soccer team, I don't know if you've read it, I mean, arguably, they generated viewership in their involvement in the World Cup that was off the charts, greater than the men's U.S. men's soccer team. And yet, they got paid a fraction of what the men get paid. So they've actually filed a lawsuit around it. So they're disrupting from the field and trying to draw attention to this issue of pay disparity rather than pay parity. So that's a good disruptor, and it's taking that issue. But then I look at it from the business side. You look at what within the NFL. There's women at senior levels of leadership now within the NFL, and they just held their first ever women's summit to draw attention to the importance of sports to young girls. They are looking at the issues. The NFL is such a fabulous platform for change, and yet perhaps not using that platform well enough. So they're looking at what could the NFL do more, the women leadership there, really looking at what could they do more around domestic violence issues and some of the issues that platform could have an important role in society.
And Graham, when we were talking this morning, you had some interesting perspectives on how there might be a real opportunity here for women as it relates to sports and business, and maybe you could share some of your thoughts around that.
Sure. My view is there is going to be a massive disruption in the whole sports business model within the next 5 years, and that will be based around the broadcast rights. And so many rights holders and so many buyers of rights are seeing that the digital short-form content position, which is overtaking their old model, and the old model is going to collapse at some point. This creates a great opportunity for all sports that have never had their fair share of that kind of airtime, including minority sports, women's sports. They've got an opportunity to grab that business model. My advice to any female leader in a sports business would be to jump ahead of the old standard linear broadcast model. Get ahead of it. Go and give your rights away. Go and give your broadcast time away to all of the short-term digital providers. Step ahead. Go for the audience rather than this small grab of rights fees from a broadcaster. You have an opportunity in that disruption to get ahead of the game. Use the business model. Get your sport to a much wider audience, because that will be the future. And if you jump ahead of that curve, you've got a great opportunity. That's
what I think is so exciting, honestly, when we look at the state of, there's so much attention around women not getting media, not getting the viewership, and they're like an emerging market. They're going to be able to leapfrog the landlines and jump forward with mobile technology.
Absolutely.
So shifting gears for a minute, so Mark, talking about sponsorships, so $60 billion a year, some estimates of how much sponsorship money it actually is being spent right now. If you look at the 2014 World Cup, I believe, billion viewers globally. How do you get value out of your sponsorships? Obviously, that's an area you're very focused on.
Yeah, it's a good question because actually, in many companies, the word sponsorship, particularly sports sponsorship, has not the best reputation. You know, it's been the whim of the chairman or chairperson to invest in something because it's their personal interest. And actually, when you look at some of the things and decisions that have been made in the past and look at the business case, it's a bit flaky. And then all you need is a change at the top, and all of a sudden the strategy's blown open. So right from the very start, the way we've approached our strategies, we have to look really carefully at what our objectives are. And really carefully for us is to understand who our future prospect customers are. And then we can very easily, through data mining, look at what their passions and interests are and where that over-indexes versus average population or average premium car buyer. So 5 years ago, pretty much every sport that existed in the world, we probably had some sponsorship in it somewhere, in some market. We've now spent the last 2 or 3 years really narrowing it down, picking a few sports that give us that connection with our prospect customers and go deep into those sports. Build a real recognition and presence in those sports as opposed to trying to approach everything. But the return on investment for us, we measure it in a lot of different ways. Obviously, if you're buying broadcast rights and your brand is being presented as an LED board or a backdrop, you can fairly scientifically measure the eyeballs that are going to see that and work out an equivalent advertising value. But we go much deeper than that. We do a lot of quantitative surveys. We look at brand perception. We look at, are we talking to the right people? Is there takeout of what we're doing as the activation around that sponsorship, which is really important, cutting through? Are they getting the messaging that we want to give out? We measure that, and we measure the earned media, so what we achieve in PR, so which is out there, digitally, print, we measure that as well. And we put that all together. And actually, one last thing. In our category, we know who our customers are. So when you buy a motor vehicle, we know who you are. So we can quite easily correlate the people we know we're talking to and whether they go and buy a car at the end of the day. So that's the ultimate return on investment is, are you selling more vehicles to that target audience?
And Graham, your perspective, this is an area you've worked in for many, many years. Sponsorships, how do you get brand value out of them?
I think it's changing. I think I agree with what Mark has said, and that's the solid base of the model. But I think it's changing now. And if you're a rights holder in sport, you need to adapt to the business model of the people that you're trying to pitch to, because very often now all the things that Mark has said are absolutely valid, but a sponsor will also demand more. They will say, well, what are you going to do to drive the brand value that I have? Because I need that brand value to be inculcated with my customers. So how does your property and your sport and what you do fit with that brand value, and what will you deliver in that area? Because ultimately, they are more than media buys. They are something that your company is associating its name for, and it expects to be connected back to its customer base in that regard. They're looking for an investment opportunity. Sponsors are almost saying, I'm not going to give you the money, I'm looking to invest in you. And therefore, what will you do with me as this part of this co-investment? And it's a model which has changed even in the last 4 or 5 years. I think we've seen far more of that, because the customers demand it of the sponsors and the sponsors demand it of the sport.
So it's more than just the event they're looking for.
So much more than the event. But I think the sponsors also got to be really smart about how they activate. So for instance, in our Rio sponsorship, one aspect of our activation in Rio was to look at the values of the IOC and this research that we did, so if 94% of women in the C-suite played sport, they care about sport. So in our activation of Rio, we started something called the Women Athletes Business Network, where we're taking women Olympians who, when their sporting career ends, they're all too young, they're in their 20s or 30s, and they don't know how to pivot to what they're going to do next. And so we're trying to help them pivot into the world of business successfully. Well, 94% of women in the C-suite care a lot about that. They love this program that we've started, and they're the buyers of our services. So that's just a way to show an activation that, to get more out of our dollars, we're enhancing the relationships with women in the C-suite.
Right. So it's interesting, in the world today, inclusive capitalism is a topic that's getting much attention, maybe defining winning differently, looking at equitable, sustainable, inclusive. And you think about what we've seen in the sports world. Most recently, of course, Maria Sharapova. Of course, everyone knows the whole Lance Armstrong story. So is winning everything? Graham, I want to get your perspective on that to start.
In professional sport, winning is everything. I mean, they prioritize. You work inside any professional sports team, and it's all about that. Everything in the team is geared towards winning, because that's what drives everything forward. It drives the investment, it drives the sponsorship, it drives the salaries, it drives everything. You've got to win. And I think there now needs to be a bit of a wider context for sport, as in sport in society. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Professional sport has gone too far away from its roots. Amateur sport was all about inclusiveness and what it was doing for the moral fiber of a society. Professional sport has nothing to do with that. There's too big a disconnect. And I think what's interesting is how business is perhaps dragging sport back towards that more inclusive capitalism because of the issues we were just talking about now, how the business will make the sport wake up a little bit. And let me give you an example of that. The millions and millions of dollars that are pouring into football. You have a completely corrupt governing body that has now been washed aside by the actions that have been taken there. You have athletes who have polluted a sport by cheating. And the Lance Armstrong reference that you make, whenever anybody mentions working in cycling, people mention Lance now and again. But the bit I think people don't focus on there is the hundreds of millions of dollars that Lance Armstrong drove out of the sport. If you look at the broadcast rights for the Tour de France, they were not sold in Germany until last year. And that's a massive impact in the sport. So my point is now sport has to think about not just winning, it has to think about its long-term future, its long-term health, and how it sits within society. Because the businesses that are investing in it will demand that.
I think also the sponsors can play a role in this. So when we have negotiations with rights holders around becoming a sponsor, a key part of the proposition we put on the table is how we're going to activate it. And by having just a few sports that we concentrate on, what we want to always do is build a pyramid beneath the halo rights, which is the Rugby World Cup, for example. But beneath that, we have lots of grassroots rugby programs. And those grassroots rugby programs with school kids, some inner city programs to get people interested in rugby, playing sport, can look up to the World Cup because we have those rights. But you build that ecosystem beneath it. And if we can go to a rights holder and say, we're going to bring more to you and grow the values of the game, grow the participation in the game just beyond paying you the cash, it's a much more equitable conversation. And I think that's the way that sponsors can play and move that on as well. Yeah.
Right. So picking up on that theme, 2014 British Open, I think there was maybe £75 million that came into the Liverpool community that weekend. You can see football, certainly in Britain, of course, all the tourists that come in to watch the games. I'm sure the numbers are approaching now $1 billion or more in terms of tourist spend as it relates to football games. Clearly, sports can mean a lot to a community, can mean a lot to a nation. Mark, maybe you can start and comment on your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, as we're on the eve now of the Euros in France, so it's quite good timing. I think football's a really good example of how you get a big tournament and it just blows away the boundaries and borders that normally exist. It's hugely powerful in terms of uniting people together. Yes, you get the very small minority that, hopefully not, but will probably spoil things a little bit on the fringes. But the greater good of the fans coming together to put aside all the other difficulties in the world and show what the human spirit can be, I think is hugely powerful. And national interest in their teams, whatever sport it is hugely important and can be really galvanising and help socially, and plus the investment side as well. Rugby World Cup, there were 2.3 million people that came to the UK to watch that, and the economic benefits of that in terms of tourist spend and the legacy is huge. So it's massively, massively important.
Other thoughts? Graham, I know you talked about all the people you saw on the flight in coming to the game.
Yeah, Irish fans talking to English fans, talking to Polish fans. I think when sport events like that can transcend, that they can have a really powerful impact in society. And if you look at the demographics, especially on gender balance in football, in a league season, you're looking at a sort of 85 to 15, if you're lucky, balance male-female. When you have a big national event like the Olympics, like the Euros, that shifts. There's a much better gender balance in terms of people looking at it, getting excited about sport, getting into sport. And that's where the really big events can have a very strong impact. Gender balance, inclusivity, celebrating the rights, human spirit that Mark talks about. And these events and sport have a responsibility to society. They take a lot. There's a lot of investment that goes in there. And they need to give back more, and they need to work harder to bring those advantages to the rest of the society that they sit within.
Right. So you look at what's happening in the world today with all the innovation, technological change and disruption, and maybe think about it in the context of, clearly everyone understands the business applications, but maybe people don't focus as much on how it's impacting sports. So you think about big data, you think about certainly what's going on with mobile technology, crowdfunding for athletes, and last but not least, esports. So let's start with you again, Graham, and get your perspective on some of these themes.
I think it's a very exciting time for sport with technology. There's many different areas you could focus on there. For me, the sharp point at the moment is that tomorrow Velon launches its race data app in the Tour de Suisse.
Right.
And that's all about bringing out the rider data and the telemetry and showing the fans just how amazing these athletes are. And the technology is catching up in sport now. They're beginning to see how they can use it better. Sport's been a very reluctant adopter of technology on the field. You look at the issues in football, it's taken them 15 years to adopt goal line technology. It's crazy. Sport is very conservative in terms of technology, in terms of showing it to the fans. They like to use it behind the scenes to get competitive advantage, but they're reluctant to show it to the fans. Those barriers are being brought down. This is be a major disruption to sport to really show people the inside of the athlete performance, everything from heart rates to the power they put out. But that's exciting only in it's new. What's really exciting, I think, for business as well as for the sport is the parallels. Everybody who looks at sport at some time has probably consumed it or played it or been involved in it. How do you compare yourself to this elite performance? How do you really get inside the body of that athlete? That's really exciting, because then you have a bridge, as Mark was talking about before. It's really important to connect the elite and use the power of the elite to inspire the mass. That's crucial for every sport. And the data and the way we use the data and the technology, that's the key, the bridge between the elite and the mass.
So the opportunity for business is you can just see all new kinds of approaches around this performance. As the performance of the elite athlete becomes more transparent to the world, your own performance becomes more transparent through all the wearable technology. You can start to gauge your own performance, and the industries that are already in place around fitness, nutrition, the emerging industries around sleep. You can just see businesses, just huge opportunities for a whole new evolution.
Definitely.
And just to give you one example of how technology is playing a role. So Jaguar hasn't been in motorsport for 11 years, since we left Formula One. In October this year, we joined season 3 of the Formula E all-electric single-seater race series. And fascinating how that's emerging as potentially the future of motorsport. I'm a huge F1 fan. I still love the sound of an F1 car, but actually having these races in city centres with the roads closed down, and where the fans themselves can vote for their favourite drivers, and that gives the power boost to the top 3 drivers in a race itself. So who would imagine that a few years ago, where the actual spectators and fans can actually vote for their drivers and have an influence on the outcome of a race? The whole way that motorsport is changing, as an example, through Formula E, I think is a really good indicator.
So I'd like to get your perspectives. Nelson Mandela said sport has the power to change the world. It can unite people in a way very few things can. We've heard some examples of how sport can transcend borders and create national pride. So can sport have a higher purpose than the bottom line, and should it? Mark?
Yes, and I think that the ties between business and sport can still evolve further. We've touched on the qualities and skills that sportsmen and women have and what they can bring to business. And I think that's still an area that is massively underexploited. When I look at CVs, when I'm recruiting, I do look at beyond the academic. I look at what their interests and skills are, and what they've experienced in terms of team sport. If they've done solo sports, then it's the values around motivation, discipline, training regimes. All those are hugely beneficial in a business context. So, I think there's a massive value there and a learning that can be better exploited than it is at the moment.
Beth?
Well, I think the fact that you used Nelson Mandela as the example of who said that is so compelling, given that he was such a great leader, and is sort of and led from behind, and he understood, maybe through sport, that importance of allowing people to innovate and run ahead, but but sort of herded the flock from behind, and knowing the role to play. As Mark, as you said, athletes, they know how to team, they know how to finish, they know how to lose, they want to be coached. There is so much more potential out of our athletes, and the importance of that, to countries, to invest in sports for their citizens, and the health of their ultimate societies, not from just a health perspective, but from a leadership perspective. Yeah. It's important.
We haven't even touched on the obesity debate, and this is your question about esports. We were joking earlier. My definition of a sport is if you don't have to change your footwear, then it's not a sport. So, but esports, as big as it's definitely going to be, it's not going to get people fit. So we've really got to think about, is that entertainment, and what is sport, and what's the role of sport in terms of health of the nations, etc.
Yeah. And Graham, I know you talked about your daughter and her participation in sports, and then of course you're tomorrow heading off to a big cycling event. So thank you again for being here. But your perspectives on that, because you had quite a lot of passion around this whole topic of sports and society.
I think sport is incredibly important, really is. And I think the difficulty we face at the moment as professional sport becomes very much away from society in some senses. It's become, being labelled as a big business is a disrespectful term to big business, in my view. I think sport has lost its connection, too much of its connection, with its heartland, which is the people who participate at the grassroots, the people who turn up and volunteer their time. People don't realise that pretty much any sport in any country would cease to exist if the vast majority of people in it didn't give up their time for free. If parents didn't coach, if parents didn't go and referee, or parents didn't marshal for courses, none of the professional sport that we look at today with all of its power and its money would exist. And the professional sport owes an obligation back to the society for those people who are giving that volunteer time to bring them in, to connect with them more, to work with them more, and generate more connection with that heartland. And if they do that, it can have a wonderful power in any society, in my view.
Great, thank you. We've just got a few minutes left. Any questions in the audience for our panel? There's one back here. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. My name is Chris, and I'm from Nigeria. And it's very interesting to me because I lived in the US for a while, and their college sports system I find really, really interesting in terms of getting very large communities involved in sports from a young age. You have like pee-wee leagues and then summer leagues, et cetera, et cetera. So for every sport, there's a very clear track to becoming a professional. But at the same time, there is a bit of a disconnect. For example, there's a lot of debate around the idea of an athletic scholarship, where the scholarship aspect is not really there. And speaking to what you mentioned as far as sports at a professional level being a little bit separate from society, and when people leave sport, they can't integrate as easily in most cases. And it's kind of in that, in the application of these leagues, in the application of student scholarships, how it works. And for me in Nigeria, it's an interesting concept because I think sport can really help in a lot of ways in terms of producing leaders and showing people how to cooperate and giving them opportunities. But at the same time, looking at the way it's been done in the US, you can also see the pitfalls as well. So what would you say as far as setting up similar situations in, for example, in developing country, and at the same time avoiding some of those pitfalls?
Well, it is interesting because when you even look at men versus women, women have gone on out post-sport to succeed and integrate better than male athletes. And I wonder if it isn't because along the way, women knew they weren't going to have life after sport because the professional leagues and women, they just don't support your existence. You know you're going to have to pivot to do something else. So women may have paid attention. My hypothesis would be they pay attention along the way to everything, whereas the men have a different aspiration and then doesn't work out, and they're not as equipped, and they have proven not to do quite as well because of that. So what can you do along the way? I think that is the role of the sporting organizations to re-challenge. Are we equipping our people with not just success in sport, but success in life, and building those skills into them? You see some coaches do that well. In other words, to be specific, take their athletes, help them understand their responsibility as a citizen. They are the brand of that team and how they behave as an individual versus just they succeed and then they go out and behave in a way that's completely inappropriate as a citizen.
Right.
There's too great a focus. I mean, just to give you a general rule of thumb, in most professional sports, in most societies, less than 0.1% make it through and pay their living out of it. So there's a massive group of people who become disenfranchised by that system. And when professional teams focus only on the 5 they want to put on the court or the 11 they want to put on the pitch, it's not then giving back to the rest of the society that they're drawing these people from. And that's something that has to be built into the professional sports model, that they do have to generate money into their academies, that they do have to balance it, they do have to, as Beth said, have a wider responsibility to actually educate people to be able to pivot and do other things, because their time is very, very short in that period when they could be an elite athlete. So the system should be built on the basis of using the skills much better. And unfortunately, it's if you don't make it to the first team or the first 5 or the championship, then you're a failure and you're pushed away. And professional sport does that very well. It gets rid of people. What it doesn't do very well is move these people into other areas and pivot on those skills and have them picked up by business. That's the piece they should definitely add in. I think your question's a very good one.
And one of the unique aspects of that that's interesting, what we're finding, and I want to do a lot more research around this, is that athletes are uniquely equipped to become entrepreneurs. Because of the training demands and all of that, they develop leadership skills that make them very agile and very well equipped to become entrepreneurs.
Well, I know there's many more questions out there, but I must apologize because we are running tight on time, and there is another presentation after us before lunch. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us. Thank our very knowledgeable and interesting speakers. And I'll leave you with a thought in the EY world of the better the question, the better the answer, the better the world works. To you, the WEOY class of 2016, what will you do for or what will you learn from sport that will help improve your business? Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.